And two parents have described the terrifying moment that killer nurse Letby was left alone with their child. Mike and Victoria Whitfield believe that their daughter Felicity was one of her first victims and said it was a mother's instinct that may have saved their child. Watch.
3 o'clock in the morning, I just had an urge to go down. I went downstairs, I sat by the cot. But as I was walking towards the cot, Lucy was standing over the cot. She just looked up at me and then walked away, and then I walked towards the cot. I sat down, and within seconds, all the beepers started going off and all hell broke loose.
Chilling. Thankfully, Felicity made it out of the Countess of Chester Hospital and she has grown up to be a healthy and happy 9-year-old. But many of Letby's surviving victims now suffer from conditions like cerebral palsy or other learning difficulties, and those families are each suing the NHS for between £1 and £20 million. Lawyers say the damages bill for the health service could total £50 million. However, it's been revealed parents of Letby's murder victims can only claim bereavement damages of £15,000. So is that a rank injustice? Indeed, should all of Letby's victims receive up to £20 million each in compensations for the family? Dan at gbnews.com, vote in our poll at gbnews on Twitter. But two brilliant guests to discuss this now. The former Tory Health Minister, David Mallow, and the former Victims Commissioner, Baroness Helen Newlove, whose husband, you'll remember, was horrifically murdered by a gang of youths in 2007. So, Helen, obviously, you know this from so many different angles. You know personally like what it's like to be a victim, but you've also spent many years working to represent victims. In some ways, it feels crude talking about finances here, but do you understand why some people are saying it's very unfair that for the families of the murdered children, they'll only receive between £12,000 and £15,000?
Totally get the when anybody mentions money, and I say this personally, is it feels like blood money, because that's the first thought in your mind, and so it doesn't sit comfortable because it doesn't bring your loved one back. However, when you step aside and look how the system is placed, they value life, the system values life at these figures. And for me, each case is completely different. I personally felt very much that I had to prove every point for my girls and from myself in Gary's murder. But for these families, they're already causing a divide because sadly there wasn't somewhere a hung jury, and there were 7 convicted murder charges. And so that then divides the family as well. And the amount that's given from criminal injuries compensation on an NHS award, they are very, very low. It does not wipe out the emotion that the people are going through. But if it helps them to actually, they may be able to function a lot better. We've all got finances. And what I always say is, it may be, this goes on the trial that we all see, but in real life, practical issues still have to be, mortgages, bills, everything else has to be paid for. And some families that we know in these cases have their children have life, changing injuries. So they've got that added burden on as well. And I just think, we need to look at this quite thoroughly in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I guess, David Mallow, one of the issues is, and you'll know this as a former health minister, of course, all of the compensation money is still being paid by the taxpayer.
I think this compensation point, though it's important, obviously, if one of the children who was a victim of Letby survived but has life-changing injuries that carry on, well, then it's right that compensation should be paid. But I think the idea of fining the NHS, for the 15 or 20 million pound bill because Letby was let loose on their children, that seems to me to be wide of the mark. What matters far more, and I cry out to see evidence that this will happen, is that we can get a system where the people who manage the NHS, first of all, pay proper respect for clinicians, and also can be punished if they fail to live up to legitimate expectations of the public and actually weed out the Letbys of this world before they cause more loss murderous injuries. I mean, where all this went badly wrong was that a group of doctors, effectively all of the doctors, in what after all was a small unit, 14-bed unit, were saying, get rid of Letby. And these idiots who were in charge thought it would be damaging to the reputation of the unit to get rid of Letby, so they wouldn't. And the doctors even had to apologise to Letby. Now, those people, there should be some way in which those people can be punished. For instance, have their fat...
criminally, do you think, David? Oh, I see. OK, so you're talking about via the NHS.
But the point I'm making is, what this exposes is a great gap, a yawning gap between clinicians and managers.
Yeah.
What we must try and be sure is that, well, for instance, in teaching, people go round and if they think a school is being badly run, action can be taken. There doesn't seem to be any basic discipline over the sort of people who were running the Countess of Chester Hospital. And that's what we have to address.
Well, indeed. I couldn't agree with that more, but I guess, Baroness Newlove, though, it still does come down to the appalling treatment of victims, because much like David's just been talking about, there were victims through this process who were crying out to be heard and did not even have their letters answered by the hospital chief executive. Then you go to the court process itself. They never got to read out their victim impact statement for Letby to actually hear, because the government has dragged its feet in terms of introducing this new legislation where criminals would be forced to be in the dock or, on the day of their sentencing. So I just wonder if you believe we treat victims with the dignity that they deserve.
No, they're not treated with dignity they deserve. And listening to David as well about the system, there's managers, there seems to be so many chiefs and not enough Indians.
Yeah.
And for me, the NHS, why are we not going for the head of the trust? Why are we not looking where, go from the top? I don't want somebody, I am so passionate about this because nobody is held accountable. The families have gone through a 10-month court trial, besides all the investigations before it came to court. Believe you me, you sit there with no legal representation, you listen to the really sensitive detail that Joe Bloggs doesn't know on the street because of the legal requirements. And quite rarely, I don't think we should as well. It's private to the family who are really going through it and have no voice. She didn't show up for the sentencing, so the victim's impact statement, she controlled that. But more importantly, the NHS never says sorry. The NHS is never accountable. And to have an inquiry on a failure to deal with the most vulnerable babies by supposed to be a caring professional is, you're going to spend millions on an inquiry, and yet it doesn't seem right and fitting to give the to support these families, not just for the health of the children that have survived, but also the health of the parents so that they can look after their children.
Totally.
It does not happen. It doesn't go together.
No,
and I'm sorry,
exactly.
But there has to be accountability. They should be in the dock. And it costs a lot of money because you need legal advice. That's where all the bills go. And they need to have a black box thinking in the NHS like the airlines, because they're never, ever going to learn. And we're going to have lessons learned, which is insulting for the families.
Hear, hear. David, just a final quick word on the fact that the government, despite promising to do something, still actually hasn't introduced legislation to force someone like Letby into the dock. As a former minister, what do you think can be done? Because there's some concerns that she can't be forced into court.
I know, of course there is, and I spent 5 years as a Home Office minister. Can I just tell you something? This is about this government and about this government's competence. I've heard on a number of occasions in the last couple of years that they want to change the law to ensure that people who are charged with offences have to turn up in court and hear things said. Do you know what? You could get a bill like that through Parliament in 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
Who is going to?
So where is it? Exactly.
They did it in South Australia in 2017.
Ask the people who are running this country.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Why don't they look? At the end of the day, I'm sorry to have to say this. This comes down to competence, and And it's a profound lack of competence that is so widely to be seen in this government and in this opposition. It has to do with the fact that politics no longer attracts people who are good at getting things done.
David Mellor. Baroness, Helen, Newlove, really fascinating and important conversation. Thank you both for being with me tonight. But who do you agree with? As bereaved parents are told they are only due £15,000, should the families of all of Letby's victims receive up to £20 million in compensation? Angel writes, not when the £20 million would be paid by taxpayers and come out of the NHS budget, so that's more patients who suffer. Veronica writes, compensation has to be considered. Children who have been murdered can't have a price tag, and no matter the amount of money will undo what this wicked woman did. Money should be put into bereavement counselling so these parents have an avenue to go to for help, and I hope they do get that, actually. Via the email, Elizabeth writes, yes, the NHS should be sued. The money could be found by getting rid of or slimming down the pay of the NHS management, or even better, get rid of the NHS and start again. Your verdict is now in. This is the closest clash for a long time. You're totally split. 49% of you say the families should receive compensation of up to 20 million. 51% say they should not.